So here we are, everybody. We are but 2 ships away from wrapping up all the ships that I saw on the 2022 US tour. But you know what they say, some of the best can be saved for last, and, well, here's USS Alabama, the first view you get as you're pulling into the overall memorial park, of which USS Alabama is, of course, the centerpiece. And as I like to say to people when I meet them, USS Alabama is pretty much one of the few things that can make a B-52 bomber look small, because they actually have one parked out here along with a C-47 and so forth. And in most circumstances, the B-52 is a pretty large plane. But yeah, park it up against a South Dakota-class battleship, and there really is no contest. Alabama is located relatively close to Mobile, of course, in the home state of Alabama. And, well, Mobile, what is it with you and squirrels? I've never seen so many. Anyway, back to the ship. BB-60 is in superb condition, and as you can see, she's actually like the South Carolina in a little bit of a hybrid state when it comes to how she's preserved, because quite a few museum ships are just moored out there in the water. They might have a dredged berth, but they are exposed to the full effects of tide and wind and waves, depending on where they are. However, as you can see just over to the left of this photo, Alabama, as I said, like North Carolina, has this kind of halfway house between being dry docked and being kept in the water. Now, for those of you who've been paying attention to various dry docks where I've answered this question a few times, having a ship in dry dock on blocks is good from a short-term perspective of the ship's not in contact with water, or large amounts of it at any rate, and therefore is much less likely to rust. So that solves one problem, but it creates other problems, because ships are not supposed to be out in the open air for prolonged periods of time. There's a reason why, when ships are launched, they're essentially launched as hulls. The superstructure basically isn't there, the main armament isn't there, a lot of their internal systems aren't there either. Once a ship has been fully constructed, if you leave it out in the open air, in a dry dock, for a very long period of time, you will eventually have bits of the ship start to sag and bend, which is something that HMS Victory has experienced over the years, and which they've had to change her dry dock setup to support and cope with. But, of course, if you put it back in the water, you have the rust issues. Hence this kind of enclosed caisson system. You can see the boundary again hit to the top left. What this does is it keeps the ship in the water where the ship is fully supported the way it's supposed to be, but at the same time, that caisson prevents a lot of the currents and the wind and wave action that would otherwise cause significant problems for a ship over prolonged periods of time, especially what's known as the wind-water line. Basically, you know, the interface between the air and the water, which is where the majority of the rust occurs, because underwater, there's water, obviously. Above, there's air, but at the wind-water line, you have the water being washed up and down and up and down and up and down, which is a lot more abrasive and therefore eventually gets to be a lot more corrosive as well. The caisson system doesn't prevent this entirely, but it does significantly reduce these effects, which means the ship is assured a much longer period of preservation in the water without the need for significant works like dry docking. And as you will have seen with North Carolina's preservation, although I don't know whether they've done it on Alabama at this point, you can also, to a certain extent, drain part or all of the caisson to work on the ship without having to move it. So a kind of impromptu dry docking, although this tends only to work if the ship is pretty much settled into the seabed or riverbed, depending on where it's stationed. But enough about the finer points of ship preservation for now. As you can see, we're getting closer and closer to boarding the Alabama, which you do on the fantail, that is the stern area. And as you can see in the wonderful Alabama sunshine, it really shows off the paintwork to a superb degree. Now, on some of the other ship tours that we've seen from my trip, we've looked at sort of a general tour route, a couple of rather different areas going up and down across the ship. Aboard Alabama, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to take a slightly more in-depth look at the ship's anti-aircraft armament, because as you can see from this photo, and as you'll see from a few others, once you get aboard, this ship has a lot of its original anti-aircraft armament still aboard. In fact, considerably more than any of the Iowa class, because obviously the Iowa class were brought back in the 1980s, which meant that with the missile refits they lost 4 out of their 10 twin 5-inch mounts, and pretty much all their 20mm Oerlikon and 40mm Bofors also went away, so any that they managed to get back have been recovered, but nowhere to the same extent as North Carolina, Massachusetts, and of course Alabama, which didn't go through those modernizations and therefore have been able to retain a lot more of their original anti-aircraft battery. North Carolina and Massachusetts you've already seen. They also have a fair number of their 40mm, and in North Carolina's case quite a lot of their 20mm. And here on Alabama they have a few additional special bits which you're now going to be introduced to. But first I have to say, this is probably my single favourite shot of the entire experience aboard Alabama, because, well, doesn't that just say America? Yes, I know. It's a friendly bit of teasing, but there are so many guns in this picture. Now, turning around from that point, you'll actually notice that although they don't have a Kingfisher or similar on the stern, they do have the full launch and recovery system for aircraft. So that's actually quite interesting if you want to have a look at it. Because, of course, again, if you go to an Iowa class, much of this system is no longer there. They do have some remnants of the systems that were used for drone recovery back in the Gulf War, but this, again, is original. So on the South Dakota and North Carolina class battleships that are preserved, some variant of this is still present, whereas on the Iowas, you get more Cold War experience. Scattered all over the ship, you can, of course, find many quad 40mm Bofors, such as this one, which is again on the fantail. But whilst they are very interesting, and a number of them are still capable of movement, the first thing we're going to look at is the smallest of the anti-aircraft guns that Alabama carried during her service in the Second World War, and that is, of course, the 20mm Oerlikon. This one has some rather useful instructions on the gun shield for the crew who are presumably trying to take aim at incoming enemy aircraft. Now, those of you who live locally to USS Alabama will be aware, but the rest of you probably won't be, that every year there is at least one major event where some very cooperative local pilots simulate a Japanese attack run, or several attack runs, on the Alabama, which then allows everybody aboard the Alabama to respond. Now, of course, you can't actually fire back with live 5-inch 40mm and 20mm ammo, but the entire event would be somewhat less spectacular if everyone was just standing around on the deck going pow, bang, zap, 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 rat-tat-tat, although it would be entertaining. And so, as a nice halfway house, they've converted a number of 20mm Oerlikons to fire, but not using powder and cartridges and charges, which would be rather expensive, but to instead fire using a butane gas system, which gives most of the look and feel and recoil without, as I said, costing a fortune in blank ammunition, and allowing everybody to experience, at least for the 20mm battery, what it might be like to be aboard Alabama whilst it was under air attack. There's no word, as far as I'm aware, that anyone's managed to successfully adapt the butane system to work on the 40mm system, and I was also advised that it definitely won't work on the 5-inch system, simply because the massive amount of increased volume that is in the 5-inch guns. And if any of you have been on USS New Jersey when she fires her 5-inch guns, even a very, very, very reduced charge is an incredibly loud and somewhat expensive experience. But back to the 20mm, which is what we were talking about.
So the wonderful crew of USS Alabama have actually got out a working 20mm Oerlikon and strapped me into it so I can experience what it was like to at least man one of these things. Obviously, we don't have Japanese Zeros on call, so unfortunately I can't shoot anything out the sky, and, you know, US interstate authorities probably take a dim view of lacing up Interstate 10 with 20mm ammo, so we're not doing that either. But you can see I am fully strapped in. We have our fire selector, so now it's on fire. Have a little trigger here, so this is your thumb trigger. You've got your sight, so you can see the plane that you're shooting at, and of course, if I rotate it this way, you can see you've got ring sight, so this is what allows you to put in deflection shooting. And as you can see, there's some nice reminders on the inside that, you know, if a plane is coming at you, you don't just point the barrel and shoot, because then you will miss. You do actually need to lead. So you've got your drum of ammunition. There's another drum just beneath, and I'm advised you lean back and you can play it round like so. So up, down. It's actually not too bad. You can feel there's a fair bit of weight to it. So, but at the same time, you know, if a plane, well, here comes a helicopter actually. So let's play track the helicopter. So he's probably coming in at about the speed that a torpedo attack aircraft would come in realistically. So yeah, it may be a bit undignified, but you have motivation if somebody's shooting at you. Whee! Yeah, there's a bit of weight to this thing. Yeah. And then obviously you have a minimum elevation, because otherwise you're going to start shooting up your own gun shield. So yeah, I imagine that, I mean, it is very fun, and you'd obviously adjust all of this for the individual settings, because with my height I have to be kind of up here to see what I'm doing, whereas down here is actually better for maneuvering the gun. But yeah, it's a huge bit of fun, but I imagine it will get very, very tiring. By the time the 15th Japanese aircraft shows up, you're going to be just as mad. You've been strapped in this thing for half an hour. You're going to have extra motivation to take that thing down, because by the time you take that down, you might actually get out and go and have a drink. But yeah, this is absolutely fantastic. And of course, if you want to see what this thing looks like and sounds like in real life, there are living history days that USS Alabama does. Look them up on their website, where you can see this thing firing, obviously blanked, and they do have some zeros on call, believe it or not, or close enough too. So definitely check out the website, go see those whenever you can.
But as we mentioned, of course, the Oerlikon 20mm is the smallest of the anti-aircraft guns that the USS Alabama carried during her service in World War II. The next step up from light anti-aircraft to medium anti-aircraft gun is the 40mm Bofors. Now, of course, the 40mm Bofors came in a number of different mounts. It had single mounts, it had twin mounts, it had quadruple mounts, and towards the very end of the war with the Royal Navy, there were even sextuple mounts. But the majority of the mountings that were carried by Alabama were quadruple mounts. And as you can see here, the quadruple mounts, to be fair, they're more like a pair of twin mounts sat on a common turntable, and as you can see on the bottom left of this photo, but actually on the right-hand side of the mount, there is a motor, because by this stage in the war, the US Navy had overcome its interwar period reluctance to put remote power control on everything, and, well, the Bofors 40mm had remote power control, but they also had a manually cranked option, which we'll see a little bit later. But let's go over and have a look at those, shall we?
So here we are on a quad 40mm Bofors mount on top of Alabama's Turret 3. Now you do have a little director down there, and obviously the whole thing can be linked into the central fire control system as well. But if those are operating, then all the people on board here need to do is basically feed ammunition, and the way you would feed ammunition is via these. So you start off with clips, but you can also just drop more and more 40mm rounds into it as it goes, so you can keep up a continuous rate of fire. So you have two pairs of 40mm guns. However, there is a chance that you might either lose the director or you might lose connection to the director, but either way it's the same thing as far as the gun is concerned. And so down here you can see this sort of black pointy object. I'm going to indicate with my foot. So if you've still got power but not direction, you can use that as a joystick, and that will steer and elevate the gun. But if you also lose power, so you're now completely inert, then you also have this, which is the elevation handle, and over the other side you also have a corresponding one, which is for rotation. And then you have your manual gun sight, so you can operate this entire thing manually if you desire. So we're just going to demonstrate how quickly you can do that with this particular mount, which is of course in situ. As you can see, we've got all the gun shielding here, and if we look down you can see we're in a tub, so more shielding there, and there's a fire control director with radar right behind us, and we're also on a level, as you can see here, with another quad 40. There's some 20s over there, some of the 5-inch, some more 40s down there, some more 20s down there as well, and of course 20s down on the deck over there, more quad 40s over there, because there's just so many anti-aircraft guns on this ship. Right, so you can't see us because we're hidden behind the gun shield, but I control the vertical and Mrs. Drac controls the horizontal. So we're gonna assume that we have a target coming in low. So torpedo craft or something is maybe coming in low off of the starboard aft quarter, and then we're going to rotate as fast as we can to our right, which will actually be to port, fast as humanly possible, whilst also elevating because he's going to be tracking over us. So go, 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 go. And oh no, he's coming back down again. So right, that was fun.
Now, obviously, we're not going to win any prizes for fast-tracking aircraft, but to be fair, a quad 40mm Bofors mount does weigh a fair bit, and yeah, you know, as I said, we're not trained US Navy crewmen, but they're not going to be an order of magnitude faster than us. So it does emphasize just why the US Navy took the decision to have the powered mountings as much as possible. Because as you can tell, you know, maybe at long distance, you could keep up tracking of an enemy aircraft, but once they get into short range and they're actually dropping weaponry, a manually directed quad 40 is going to really struggle trying to point itself in the right direction, although maybe you could anticipate where they're coming and just aim for a static point or something like that. And hence why you have those multiple layers of redundancy built in. As I pointed out at the beginning of the video recorded segment, you have the joystick, which allows you to direct the gun using the power provided by that little motor and generator, even if you don't have the remote power tracking available from the fire control systems, which is entirely possible. You know, it's a 40mm mount. It has cabling running from the fire control directors, but it's possible that blast or splinters or bullets or all sorts of things might sever the connection to any individual mount whilst the action is going on, at which point, you know, it's better to have the thing at least partially in action than not at all. And exactly how many Oerlikons and Bofors the ship carried did vary somewhat during the war. A general trend on US battleships was initially, of course, for them to be having the 1.1-inch Chicago pianos, but those didn't last too long once war actually got started, and certainly the South Dakotas, by the time they were commissioned, this was a weapon that was on its way out. Originally, the South Dakota class, of course, designed in the late 1930s, was supposed to support a mixture of 50 cal machine guns and the 1.1-inch or 28mm quad autocannons, but by the time the first of the South Dakota class are actually commissioning, the 50 cal armament's been reduced. The 1.1-inch has actually been upgraded. There's more of them because they're the only things they've got in terms of medium-ish anti-aircraft weaponry, but the Oerlikons are already coming in. And by the end of 1942, as more and more South Dakotas come online, the 50 cals are being removed, the 1.1 inches are being reduced, the 20 mils are increasing, and the first Bofors are coming in. And by 1943, which is when all four of the South Dakota class are in service, you've lost the 1.1-inch completely, and you now have huge amounts of Bofors, as well as obviously huge amounts of Oerlikons, and those are increased and increased and increased right up to the end of the war. But of course, looming over this all, in some cases quite literally, is the 5-inch 38 dual-purpose mount, of which Alabama, like Massachusetts and North Carolina, retains her full suite of 20 in their 10 twin mounts. So, of course, these guns are considerably more complex, not just in the guns themselves, but also in their ammunition feed systems, whereas the 20 mils and the 40 mils are basically put wherever you like. You can see a quad 40 over there on the left and a little platform tub. This means that their ammunition feed systems consist of stacking a bunch of ready-use ammunition nearby and then manually trucking it up from the magazines when you begin to run out. The 5-inch, however, have their own full ammunition feed systems and are obviously installed in specific places on the ship by design. So let's take a look into that system.
Okay, so we find ourselves in the 5-inch 38 handling room, one of 10 such handling rooms that you would find on a South Dakota class battleship. And this is obviously just one corner. Off to the left out of view you've got cases for the charges. Over here you've got some of the different types of ammunition that we fired. So you've got white phosphorus rounds, handily indicated by WP. These blue rounds with the stars on them, star shell, very useful for illuminating the enemy. And then down here, some of the more regular rounds that be present in much greater numbers. You also have obviously a phone here so people can find out what's going on. And over here, this is where shells would come up from the magazine. So we're immediately below one of the 5-inch 38 mounts, but obviously you don't want a direct line straight down to your magazines, because if one of those mounts takes a hit, well, that's going to end badly. So you have the shell come up from the magazine to here, and then it would be transferred over to the hoist where it would go up to the final gun. Now this is a 5-inch 38 round, well, it's a 5-inch round for a 5-inch 38 gun, and this is the actual weight that they would have been. So when you see all those training videos and wartime videos where these are being tossed around like candy to get in the guns, because, you know, there's a little bit of motivation going on when Japanese planes are coming at you. Let's see how heavy it actually is. Oh my word, right. So it is manageable. I can't imagine those people in those videos where, you know, when you see them literally, they come out and they throw, and there's a bit of a inertia to that thing. So you'd have to pick this thing up, take it over to here and put it in nose first if it's an anti-aircraft round so it can get its fuse set, and then off it would go. But good grief, this thing is, you can tell why the shell weight of secondary and dual purpose shells was such a major issue in the interwar design considerations, because yeah, even with multiple crew, I can't imagine how on earth you'd keep a steady stream of those things going except by pure adrenaline. I suppose if the threat is all the Japanese will bomb and torpedo your ship into oblivion, you have a fair bit of motivation, but that can only go so far. There's going to be an awful lot of build-up of muscle going into those things. So individually it's not too heavy, it is a manageable load, but when you're on your 50th or 60th round, you're going to start feeling it. So let's have a look around some of the other parts. So we're kind of now flipped around. The hoist from the magazines is just down there, so we're now facing the hoist that we were not able to see in the previous shot. And as you can see, you have two sections. There's a shell, basic training round here, just waiting to go up, nose down, as was necessary for the fuse to be set properly. And you'll notice, warning, keep hands out of hoist. That is for a good reason, because once you lock these things up, I mean, this is a couple of kilos of metal, and it's not just on a spring or a hinge. There is actually a proper linkage there, so that will quite happily eat your hand if you're not careful. And these things, you know, we just saw how heavy they are. This has to be boosted up a level quite quickly, so, you know, even if closing that might not take your hand off completely because it is just rounded, when that shell goes up, it's taking anything that's in the way with it. So obviously the other thing you've got to bear in mind is that this is currently configured in one direction. Up above us is the mount. This is integral to the mount, and above me is the clips that are holding the mount in, but also the ring of teeth by which the mount rotates. So as this thing goes around, these are moving around as well. So it's not just a case of pick up shell, insert into hoist, up goes shell. This is very much a moving target for the crew. And of course, if you're stuck here at action stations for an extended period of time, because Japanese kamikazes are usually not kind enough to schedule their attacks with you in advance, and they may show up at any time over a considerable period, well, you can't just say, well, sir, please, can I undog that hatch and run off down to the heads, and we just hope for the next 10 minutes that no more attackers come. So if you're caught short, then, well, there's a bucket down there, And there's a little bracket that's been put in the corner there. As you can see, there's a little bit of loo roll. Put a little broom handle or something in there, and there is where you'd have to relieve yourself, probably much to the disgust of everybody else who had to put up with it. It's right below the medical kit, so I guess that's the thing. There's an elevating gear as well, and some ready-use shells stored there. Plenty of electronics all along the walls. There's a rack, another rack over there for more cases for charges. And if you were under here, bearing in mind there are no portholes, that hatch over there would have been completely locked up. You have no idea what's going on unless somebody is kind enough to tell you. Now, I don't know if it carries over the mic, hopefully not, but you can actually hear people having conversations in the mount above us. So they've got So you can actually hear conversations of people in the mount above us. So they've got a slightly better idea of what's going on. Not tremendous amount, you can't see too much out of a 5-inch 38 turret, but something. So you could yell up to them in between the gun blasts and ask them what's happening. But to be perfectly honest, you're very unlikely to actually know anything about the target beyond what you've been told over the PA system, unless and until somebody yells down, oh yeah, X or Y is happening. So if you were on USS South Dakota at the Battle of Guadalcanal, and you're engaging enemy surface targets, the only way that the crewman down here is going to know that will be by the kind of shells that he's feeding in. So if they're feeding in anti-surface high explosive rounds, like, oh, okay, we're probably shooting at a ship, maybe a ground target. If you're feeding anti-aircraft shells, well, you're shooting at aircraft, and so on and so forth. But the biggest indication that everything was going on upstairs would have been the reports of the 5-inch guns, because they're going to be coming down here quite loudly. And hopefully that's all you'll hear, because if you're stuck in a really bad case, you might hear the impact of something up above, and then it's a case of, one, you know the guys who are up there, so who knows which of your friends is coming back to the dinner that night. But secondly, you're also hoping that whatever is hit up there is either hit and deflected off the armour, or if it's got through the armour, it's expended enough of its energy that it's not going to get down here. Because again, no portholes, one hatch that's been dogged. If something comes down here, you aren't getting out. So we find ourselves here in the lower part of the shell handling operation. Now this area contains 2 hoists here, 1 on each side, and then 2 more back there. There would be 4 rooms like this in the ship, each of which services 2 5-inch mounts, and then 1 on each side of the ship that services a single mount, because of course there's 10 mounts, but there therefore are 5 of these rooms, 3 per side. Now over to my left, your right, you can see an entrance to the powder room, and there you can see where the powder will be passed through, and that will go up the ammunition hoists. But where the camera is, it's actually sitting on top of a rack of 5-inch shells, which I'll be showing in probably up here in the corner. And all of those shells would be then also fed into the ammunition hoists. Now, as we saw in the upper handling area, there are already shells stored there. So obviously they have the shorter distance to go. They just need to be fed into the hoist that goes up 1 level. This has to go up a couple of levels to get to there, which then has to be transferred to go up to the 5-inch guns. So you really don't necessarily want to be feeding ammunition from here immediately, which is why you've got the ammunition in the upper handling room. If there's an immediate threat, that is what will be expended first. And whilst that's being expended, or after it's been expended, depending on how serious the threat is and how quickly everyone's reacting, you'll then have ammunition fed from here up to there, and then either, depending on how they're working, either be used to restock the ready use ammunition there, or just fed, as we showed, straight into the upper handling room, straight up into the 5-inch mount. And obviously the exact height of these hoists to the 5-inch guns will vary depending on which mount we're looking at, because some of the mounts are higher than others. So when the ship was in service, this deck would not have been grey. You can see there's little flecks of, well, I can see, maybe you can't, there's little flecks where the paint has chipped away, and there's the an underlying red colour, and obviously down in the 16-inch rooms it would have been bare steel and greased. So this is where ultimately all these 5-inch shells come from, and you'll probably be able to see, as I'll be playing through some video from the powder room, just how many cases there are, and it gives you an idea of just how many shells you had to carry. Because after all, it's all very well and good having, you know, 25-inch 38 caliber guns with a really, really high rate of fire, but if you don't carry enough ammunition to service those guns, you'll have a few mad minutes and then you're very, very vulnerable.
And of course, all of this only covers how you feed ammunition to the 5-inch guns and how you operate and some of the locations of the 20mm and 40mm. That's not even going into the clipping rooms, the magazine storage for the 20mm and the 40mm ammo, fire control, the links to the fire control, the multiple different fire control director systems, one of which you can see here. Well, actually, you can see two here if you look very carefully. Plus, of course, the air search radar to look out for incoming air raids ahead of time so that everyone knows where they should be pointing. And, of course, the rather large elephant in the room that is the ship's main battery armament, the 16-inch guns. Turret 3 you can see here with that quad 40mm mount stuck on top of it, which is where we were earlier. Now, obviously, we have covered the main battery of a South Dakota-class battleship aboard USS Massachusetts, but Alabama has her own displays and her own areas to tour as well. But as we said, with this particular video, trying something a little bit different by doing a little bit more detail on one specific aspect of the ship systems. But to highlight, obviously, there is a huge amount more that you can look at aboard the Alabama. And not that other ships don't photo well, they usually actually do very well, but Alabama has something of a unique advantage that you can probably tell with all of these photos, which is that, well, she tends to get quite a lot of sunny weather with some very clear skies, which really shows off her paintwork, but also, unlike most of the other museum ships, she's not actually moored right next to a city or some other kind of heavily populated area. There's just I-10 in the background, which means you can get some significantly more sweeping shots of the ship without interference from random background clutter. And if somehow your tour leaves you with a little bit of free time, there is, of course, a whole lot of other stuff in the Memorial Park. There's tanks, there's planes, the aforementioned B-52, for example. There's even an entire submarine up onto the stocks as well. So you don't just have to go and see the Alabama. You can go and see all those other displays as well. And there's even a small air museum. So there's not just the C-47 and the B-52 sitting outside. There's a whole bunch of single and twin-engined aircraft inside a large hangar, which is also where you go and get your tickets to come aboard, which is quite handy because it means that you don't have to stand out in the baking sun all the time, just when you want to. But just quickly ducking inside, there are a number of interesting features which you can look at, which obviously are directly related to what we've just been looking at, because they have turned portions of the interior of the ship into a full-on museum as well. This is stitched together from about 15 photos I took, because it is a huge and very detailed cutaway diagram of the interior of a South Dakota-class battleship. And so rather than taking one little zoomed out shot, which I don't think you actually can, at least with my camera, because you'd end up running into a bulkhead before you can get it all in frame, I decided to take a ton of smaller photos, well, closer in photos, and then stitch them all together, resulting in this. But if you want to see the full size thing and examine every single compartment down to the tiniest detail, again, go aboard the ship. And they have some really impressive little displays, such as this. This shows you what riveting plates together was like, how it was done, why it was done. There's a whole bunch of explanatory text, which is just out of shot here, and it contrasts that with welding, which was taking over from riveting around about the time that Alabama was being designed and constructed. And as you can see from this setup, this is actually how you weld two pieces of steel together on a ship, and as you can see from the A, B, C, D section there, it is actually a fairly complicated process, even if it is somewhat weight-saving compared to riveting. And for those of you who picked up on the slight mistake in the USS Iowa video with the types of 20mm shell, etc. that were on display on the outside, various of you pointing out that's the 20mm shell from the CIWS, well, here aboard Alabama, in this case, are examples of the World War II era 20mm, 40mm and 5-inch rounds, plus a handy colour chart you can just see there to the right of the 20mm shells, which tells you what each kind of shell is by its coloration. And you can see there's a variety of 20mm. The 40mm clip is made of all the same, and again, obviously there's only one 5-inch, so that is what it is. But we have one more highlight for you, as the USS Alabama staff were very generous with their time and expertise, obviously letting me onto the 2040mm mounts and into the various sections of the 5-inch turret and its various ammunition feed sections. But I was also lucky enough to be able to talk for about 10 minutes about Alabama and what she's doing now. So listen in carefully.
Okay. So, at the end of a very, very warm and wearisome day, but an absolutely excellent day, we find ourselves here on the starboard aft quarter of USS Alabama, and we have with us the curator. So perhaps you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yes, hi. Yeah, my name is Shay McLean. I'm the curator of USS Alabama Battleship Memorial Park. I've been here for about 12 years. It's a position I've had that I tell you, it's a passion. This park, 155 acres, not only of a battleship, but we also feature the USS Drum, historic Gato class submarine, 30 aircraft, tanks, artillery, and you name it. We've also even got a nature preserve, we've got a fishing pier, we've got so much going on here. But of course the namesake, the USS Alabama, is our pride and joy and the star of the show.
Yes, and what a star it is. I mean, as you know, when I came on board, I was a little bit blown over by just, you know, the ship's in excellent condition. She's got pretty much almost her entire World War II anti-aircraft fit. There's even a deck catapult. Okay, it's not necessarily the original, but it's there, which it isn't on a lot of other ships.
And we've even got one of the Kingfisher aircraft that was on the back of the Alabama in the aircraft pavilion, because you know, we are prone to hurricanes here on the Gulf Coast. So we originally had her mounted on the fantail, but one of the hurricanes decided to knock her off, so we figured she would be better off inside.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, obviously you've got the aircraft hangar. There's all sorts of aircraft over there, everything from obviously naval-related aircraft and other. I mean, there's I noticed a few Firebee drones hung up in the rafters.
Absolutely. A Vietnam gunboat, an entire display for it. And you know, our park, we honor the veterans. Our mission is to honor the veterans of all wars. It's not just a World War II park. So we have exhibits back to the American Revolution, the Civil War, War of 1812, World War I. We had a large centennial event here, and we have a very nice World War I exhibit over there to commemorate the centennial of the ending of the First World War, or the Great War. So there's a lot to see here, a lot to do. It's not just World War II, and it's not just the battleship.
Yeah, and when we were just discussing before we went live, you know, there's remains of gun batteries and harbour blockade sections from the Civil War. People have been telling me I've got to come back because there's forts and everything in the local area.
Yes. A very great naval sea battle, the Battle of Mobile Bay, was fought here, where Admiral Farragut, commander of the Gulf Blockading Squadron, was just offshore here in the Gulf of Mexico. A tremendous battle ensued. One of the turning points of the American Civil War occurred just beneath where we're standing here. This is in fact the position of the Upper Bay Confederate obstructions. So again, there are literally dozens of shipwrecks within a stone's throw from here. Historic sites, old fortresses. There's a French fort here, Fort Charlotte, that was eventually handed over to the British, and then Fort Charlotte. And I'm sorry, the French fort was Fort Conde, and then the British fort was Fort Charlotte, and then it is still remnants of it that can be seen in the city of Mobile. So again, within a mile or so distance, there is a lot of history going on here.
And you get I must admit, again, you get the kind of the sense of the scale of how everything is different naval-wise when you're here, because if you you can go to a tank museum and look at a tank and go, this is a big piece of metal, and then you go to an aircraft museum and like, this is an even bigger piece, mostly of metal, occasionally of canvas and wood. But then when you're up on the forward port quarter and you're looking down at some of the displays, and there's a C-47, which, to be fair, in most aircraft museums would be something of a centerpiece.
Huge. It would take up most of their building.
Yeah. And then you look down, it's like, oh, it is like a little toy.
Absolutely.
Next to the vastness that is the Alabama, and as I was saying earlier, you know, this ship's in such good shape. You've got working 20 mils, which you kindly let me have a play with. We've got working 40 mil. the turrets look like they could be moved, although they're probably locked in place, I would imagine.
They do move, as
move?
a mac. Yeah, now we have to move them manually. They're not hooked up electrically as they originally were. But you know, that redundancy that you spoke about, there was another way to move those guns if you absolutely had to. It's painstakingly slow, and you have to do it with a hand wrench. But it can be done.
Okay. Yeah. So she's in pretty good working order then.
Absolutely, and you know, that's one of the things that we really take great pride in here at this park. We not only want things to look clean and to look, you know, fairly new, but we want them to also operate if absolutely possible. If you were to go down into our machine shop, there's an 18-inch lathe down there. There are several very large drill presses. They all work.
Oh, right.
You can actually mill things on the machines from these ships. They were that well made, that well built, that it only took just a bit of work to drain the old fluids, put some new fluids in, change out some of the rubber gaskets and such, and they still work. So yeah, an amazing piece of history. Things were built to last, and with a little bit of care and a little bit of renovation, we can make them work again.
Yeah, and you, I know early on in the day we were talking about the fact you have your living history crews coming on board.
Absolutely.
To simulate how the ship would have been run, and some locals who like to.
And I'm so glad you brought that up, because when you visit some of these ships museums, you know, it's not about the structure, the naval architecture. It is about the people. It is an anthropological thing that is important. Yes, it's a wonderful piece of technology, but it's the human element, the human stories involved in the ship that are the most important chapter of that ship's history. And so we try to stress that. And one of the events that we have, the Living History event, we initiated that when we still had a large number of our World War II veterans, which are sadly, most of them are no longer with us. But when we initiated that program, our Living History crew came on board during their annual crewmen's reunion. They met these men. They sat down with them. They soaked up every story that they had. And now they are taking that and passing that baton to the next generation for them. So they're taking some of these anecdotal stories that you're not going to find in any history book. You're not going to see in any naval report. These are personal, individual stories that are simply shared from individual to individual. And that's what really adds color and texture to the ship and its story, are the stories of the men who served. And so that Living History crew passes that tradition on, and they also do that by demonstrating the skills that these men had on board ship. And as we showed you earlier on the AAA guns, especially the 20s, these guys run out, they've all been converted to propane and oxygen mix, so they look, they sound, they feel as though they are really firing ammunition, but they're firing gas. So the bang is there, the flash comes out of the muzzle, and then the aircraft come and fly overhead. You really feel, it's as close as you're ever going to get to experiencing what it was like to be a sailor on the fantail of a battleship, pulling the trigger on a 20-millimeter Oerlikon, and have any clue as to what it was like. And you're going to get that experience if you come here and visit us during that Living History event.
So I definitely recommend, for those of you who can, please do try and make it. If I can, obviously I've got to come back next year anyway, because there's so much more of the ship to see. There's only so many hours in the day.
It's a floating city, and you've seen just a sliver of what it offers.
So I'll be back next year. Exactly when, I don't know, but if I can line it up with one of the Living History days, obviously I definitely will. I'm definitely looking forward to, well, either way, whatever happens, coming back. It's been such a pleasure and an honor to come here, and thank you very much for accommodating me.
Hey, it's been a pleasure and honor having you, and we hope you'll come back and see us again soon.
Will do, definitely.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you.
And so, once again, obviously, huge thanks to Shay and the rest of the Alabama crew. Just a few little bits and pieces to help you plan your visit to Alabama. She's open every day except Christmas Day and, of course, massively inclement weathers like hurricanes between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. with last admission at 4 p.m. And as of the time and date that this video is going out, which is in June 2023, the next Living History crew drill will be on August the 12th, 2023. Followed by another one on October the 7th. And of course there's a lot more information which can be found on the website, which is linked in the video description below. And so with that, it was time for me and Mrs. Drac to head off quite literally into the sunset to the last ship that we would visit on our 2022 USA tour, that of course being USS Wisconsin, which will be coming up next month. Thanks very much for listening, and see you again in another video.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.